Hello friends, or perhaps I should say, greetings citizens. I'm Thomas Waters and welcome to my video series on revolutions and the making of the modern world. This series is about the history of revolutions over the past 2.5 centuries. Liberty or death. Today I'll be discussing the French Revolution. I suppose the first thing I should say is that the French Revolution was relatively short compared with the Russian, Chinese and other seminal revolutions of the modern period. It's always debatable and disputable about when revolutions actually began, but by my reckoning, the French Revolution began sometime around 1788 when King Louis XVI set in motion a meeting of the Estates General in a desperate attempt to solve his kingdom's financial crisis. And it ended 11 years later on 18th Brumaire, as it was in the revolutionary calendar, or the 9th of November 1799. In Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat, when the brilliant general installed himself as First Consul of France while declaring, "The revolution is over. I am the revolution." I can't talk about it all, but I would like to talk about its origins and some of its less commented upon spiritual or religious features. And I'd like to begin by challenging the old Marxist idea, or cliché you might say, that the French Revolution was the political expression of a rising middle class, overthrowing the feudal order. Now, it's true that there were lots of bourgeois people involved in the French Revolution, and it's also true that one of the earlier things the revolution did was abolish feudalism in the National Assembly's decrees of August 1789. But it's a fantasy to imagine that all the revolutionaries were of and acting for the middle class. The French Revolution was an interclass movement, or interclass process, I suppose. The crowds who sacked the customs houses surrounding Paris, who raided the arms depots, who stormed the Great Bastille prison in July 1789, they weren't on the whole middle class, nor were the peasants in the countryside who, during the summer of 1789, revived at a national level a technique of peasant rebellion that had been practised since the Middle Ages by attacking noble chateaux, then burning and destroying their records so that rents and fees couldn't be levied. This great fear, as it became known, created the panicked atmosphere in which the National Assembly officially decreed the abolition of the feudal regime. And those peasants and townsfolk were part of France's struggling populace, which, because it had been growing faster than the economy, and particularly than the agricultural sector, since the early 18th century, was being stretched by growing want, declining living standards, and inflation, particularly in the increasing cost of food. This long-term trend was exacerbated and aggravated by the fact that there had been few really abundant harvests in the decade or so before the revolution, and it underlines the dangers for governments of inflation, particularly if the population spends a large proportion of its budget on food. In this respect, pre-revolutionary France has vague parallels with parts of North Africa in 2010 on the eve of the outbreak of the Arab Spring. Unhappy sections among elites, aristocracies, and those accustomed to power and privilege can be fomenters of revolution, even if they don't ultimately know or control where the revolution goes. This dynamic was noted by Aristotle in the Politics, and it's existed since ancient times. And in the French Revolution too, along with peasants and townsfolk, there were noble supporters of the revolution, at least initially. The Marquis de Lafayette might be the most distinguished of those, though not a typical example. And beyond active noble supporters of the revolution, there were more who acquiesced or who refused to support Louis XVI's unreconstructed monarchy. In salons and Freemasons' halls, France's nobles had for decades been absorbing Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, social contracts, and the legitimacy of the national or general will. They'd also been enjoying a growing body of scurrilous and illegal literature, which lampooned the church and monarchy with unlikely combinations of philosophy and pornography. But as well, like much of the rural and some of the urban population, some at least of France's nobles were downwardly mobile during the middle and later 18th century. This was because the economy and opportunities provided by the state, army and church didn't grow at the same pace as noble clan and family sizes were increasing. To put it another way, there simply weren't enough elite posts for all the elite candidates. By way of a loose comparison, you might think of it somewhat like today, when the number of candidates for graduate jobs increasingly and depressingly dwarfs the number of those posts. Pre-revolutionary France's alienated nobles raised two wider points as well. Firstly, that exclusively popular revolts seldom succeed. Successful revolutions invariably involve alliances with sections of a resentful, aggrieved, alienated elite. Secondly, rapid population growth resulting in societies with comparatively large cohorts of young people, can present governments and states with difficult and potentially explosive social problems. Again, there are echoes here with the Arab Spring of 2010-12. Next, let me turn to the question of what precipitated the French Revolution, Louis XVI's financial crisis and bankruptcy, which was declared in 1787. It's often said that it was the result of France's involvement in the ruinously expensive American War of Independence. Again, it's true that the war debt was beyond the monarchy's ability to repay, but it's also true that the American War was the cheapest and shortest of France's 18th-century wars. It was half the cost, in fact, in real terms, of the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. The real problem for Louis XVI was that the French state's tax base hadn't grown with the economy, with taxes falling heavily on agricultural land, but trade and industry being taxed relatively lightly, compared both with competitors like Britain and with France during the early 18th century. The parlements, the very loosely representative bodies of towns and cities where much of that trade and industry took place, they used their legal privileges to refuse and reject proposed reforms to put the French crown on a sounder financial footing. It was this that precipitated the financial crisis, which in turn made calling the Estates General necessary, the third estate of which, along with some defectors from the noble and clerical estates, in June 1789 reconstituted itself into the new National Assembly, claiming executive powers in place of the king. What I've said so far touches on just a few aspects of the French Revolution's outbreak. I encourage you to look elsewhere for the full and fascinating chronology, including the inconsistencies between the theory and implementation of natural rights, the radicalisation of the revolution during a time of war, the creation of the first modern conscript army, the attempts to reconstitute the Catholic Church and then develop a new secular religion, the civil war that broke out in Western France in 1793, partly as a result, the execution of Louis XVI and declaring of a republic, the attempt to govern through terror, and the repressive reaction against that near anarchy which saw the revolution, like Saturn, consume its brightest children, including a great proponent of the Reign of Terror, Maximilien Robespierre himself. I would, however, like to talk about an important, though easily downplayed, ritual and in the broadest sense spiritual facet of the French Revolution, and that facet is its odes. These odes were sacred, fortifying, bonding, courage-building, ideology-spreading, supercharged promises. Promises solemnly and publicly sworn in highly ritualistic manners to support and sustain the revolution. Such oaths abounded, and one recent study in fact calls them a constant practice and practically a new religion. Better known examples include the Tennis Court Oath of June 1789, when the National Assembly swore not to be dispersed, and the Ecclesiastical Oath of January 1791, through which France's clergy were supposed to publicly swear before their congregations and after Sunday Mass that they supported both the revolution and its drastic reorganisation of the Catholic Church. Only about half of them did swear that. Oaths meant something, and they weren't taken lightly. But many other oaths littered the revolution. They were the centrepieces of revolutionary festivals. They were the focus of many revolutionary paintings and images. And what we're talking about here basically is odes a bit like this one, reportedly sworn by Jacobins, supporters of radical forms of revolution, in a little Brittany town in January 1790. Let us swear on our honour and the altar of the nation, in the presence of the God of armies, to remain forever united by the bonds of the closest brotherhood, to fight the enemies of the revolution, to uphold the rights of man, to support the new constitution of the kingdom, and at the first signal of war, the rallying cry of our armed phalanx will be to live free or to die. The fact that what in some ways were traditional oaths figured so prominently in the mechanics of the French Revolution was painful for some exponents of the Enlightenment climate of opinion that blew across much of the 18th century Atlantic world. One such figure was Thomas Paine, English polemicist, key proponent of both the French and American revolutions, and probably the most widely read political thinker in the late 18th century. But the reason I mention odes is not really to underline the tensions within the Enlightenment. Instead, it's to illustrate the importance of ritual and spirituality in many revolutions. This may perhaps be hard to appreciate, or at any rate seem surprising, in some parts of the contemporary secular West. But as many anthropologies of rebellion and revolution in Africa, the Middle East, South America and elsewhere have shown, religion, faith, spirituality, ritual and sometimes magic too often figure prominently. In conventional Western Marxist analysis, this has been seen as a form of primitive rebellion to be superseded inevitably by more effective secular forms of organisation and action. That, I suppose, is the drift of Eric Hobsbawm's primitive rebels, but I'm not sure about this. Revolutions, the sex of politics, as H.L. Mencken called them, entail heady, exciting, powerfully emotional events. Perhaps rituals and spirituality help in some way to control that emotionalism, to direct it and use it to build courage, solidarity and purposefulness. Is spirituality part of successful revolutions? I think that's up for debate. Now, it's almost time for me to stop talking. In other words, I've got an exercise for you. Take a look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, adopted by the National Assembly in August 1789. Read through the 17 clauses and do a little bit of research, thinking and note-taking on these 3 questions. 1. Where did the ideas in the Declaration come from? 2. How far did these ideas govern or shape the course of the French Revolution? And 3. To what extent did these ideas inform the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948? As always, I wish you the best of luck.